Okay, so in this section of our lectures, I'm going to introduce a game theoretic model of civil conflict. You will notice that I've assigned a reading to you. This is section 7.4 in your book, and there one of the papers that they cite is by this guy called Fearon, 2004, and he talks about why civil conflict starts, does it take so much time, and really has a theoretical underpinning. And so, in this particular case, I want to talk a little bit more about the theoretical underpinning of the evidence that Fearon finds, and I'm going to highlight something called commitment mechanism. And now this is going to be a little bit different from the neoclassical model that we've already talked about. In the neoclassical model, remember, the issue was greed versus grievance, and we showed how actual opportunity costs of conflict matter and that there was a benefit to it. Nevertheless, even in that sort of rational choice perspective, grievance led sort of approaches led to a lot more of rebellious acts, if you will, a lot more intensity than greed led or greed caused sort of conflict. At least those were the testable hypotheses we got from that particular that particular reading. And in fact, you'll notice there's evidence for that in section 7.4. But there's an additional factor that we want to talk about today, which is this commitment mechanism. Because at the end of the day, what the rebels do and what the state does kind of matters to each other, right? And so I do something, the state does something else, and that makes me want to do something. And so this kind of interaction it's important to highlight, and it gives us some actionable intelligence. And as we do that, we're going to be doing kind of the usual sort of methodology. So basically, we want to understand what causes conflict, right? So we want to understand what causes conflict. And then we want to see, if we understand this causation, can we actually do something to reduce conflict? But before we do any of that stuff, we need to kind of figure out how to develop a testable hypothesis from these kinds of modeling. And basically what we have here is an economic approach, right? And so at the end of the day, it's about theory that leads to kind of testable hypothesis that we test out, and then we kind of identify causality, right? And so what we'll have is a model with the rebels and the state. Now, by the way, it doesn't have to be the rebels and the state. It could be between different rebel groups. And as a matter of fact, it could just as well be between states, but we're applying it to civil conflict. And basically, we're going to have the model where if you somehow get everybody to peace, that's great for everybody, right? But nevertheless, there are forces in place that, that if I defeated you first, then I don't have to worry about peace. And hey, that's about it. If this was actually in class, I would have gotten you all to develop this model. But, it's not in class. So I'll talk a little bit about it. And really, we're going to highlight the issue of patience and the commitment problem. So without further ado, let's come up with our basic model that we've seen before. So this is not going to be anything new. So let's see how that goes. And here we are in this model. So you have the rebels, and then you have the state. So the choice is between peace and war, peace and war. Obviously, if you have peace, you get 3-3. If you have war, the person who chooses war wins because the other person is at peace, and so they can be defeated. And if both go to war, everybody's sort of worse off. But maybe not nearly as much as, if you were caught sort of snapping, as it were, and you got that 0, right? So we all know what's going to happen here. So in these kinds of games, we know that that's the Nash equilibrium. And to that extent, we have to kind of understand what the issues are here. So first of all, in order for peace to happen, you need to have a repeated game where the repetition has some chance delta, and two, you need to have some threat of punishment. And so what do we normally do? We calculate the net present value of peace. And when you do that, that's basically 3 plus 3 delta plus 3 delta squared. You know this, you've seen this before. And that's 3 over 1 minus delta. And then the net present value of war. By the way, notice this is all very kind of rational, right? Net present values are important. And that gives you not 2. You start with, you go into war because you want to get that big payoff of 4. You want to win. But then, you're in war forever. And that's 2 delta plus 2 delta squared, yada, yada, yada. And that's equal to 4 plus 2 delta over 1 minus delta. And in this kind of a scenario, peace is chosen over war if the net present value of peace exceeds the net present value of war, which basically means 3 over 1 minus delta is bigger than 4 plus 2 delta over 1 minus delta. So that's basically 3 bigger than 4 minus 4 delta plus 2 delta. Again, I'm not belaboring the point. It's basic algebra, and we've done it before. So that gives us 4 minus 3 on this side and bring this 3 to that side. And then I'll bring these deltas to the other side. And that'll give us 4 delta minus 2 delta. And that's going to be 2 delta is bigger than 1, or delta is bigger than half. And of course, the number half is somewhat meaningless. The idea is that peace is possible only if the future is certain. Now, what does that mean? So this basically means that both parties need to be able to commit to peace, commitment, only if they believe that the future is more certain, right? Now think about that a little bit. When you're in a conflict situation, do you think the future is more certain? You're actually in the war, right? Conflict has started. So what are the chances people are going to come to the negotiating table? So in a dynamic like this, unless there's a third party that kind of raises the likelihood that tomorrow is going to happen, a third party like let's say a hegemon, like the Soviet Union or the United States, says, you know what, we make sure that you guys exist. Unless that happens, conflict is going to continue, right? So that's something to keep in your mind as you look at the sections that I've asked you to read, right? So basically, here's some thoughts that I'm going to leave you with. So one, once conflict starts, the future, by definition, becomes less certain. So, once the conflict starts, it continues. This is something called path dependence. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we look at some more results. 2, future uncertainty makes it very hard to commit to peace deals. 3, once war starts, maybe only a third party can provide the security to make the future certain enough for peace to happen. See what I mean? And so, in other words, basically what we have is a bargaining failure. That comes out of future uncertainty. So here's an application of the model that we actually worked on, right? And it's a very powerful model. And it turns out that it explains, a whole bunch of stuff, right? It also explains a lot of other things as well. So, for example, with the greed and grievance model, the question, if people were greedy enough, they would kind of go to war. But here, notice that if people might be greedy, they might want to get to that 4 right there. But nevertheless, even if they want to get that 4 right there, peace is still possible if delta is high enough, right? So that explains why, even if there are lots of resources around, war is not inevitable. See what I mean? So this is kind of goes to the issue of motive and opportunity that we briefly talked about. Just because there's opportunity and motive doesn't mean there's going to be war. There are other factors that come in. For example, this idea of certainty, right, in these strategic interactions. And that's something that I think it's important to keep in mind. And I'll show you how you see these tipping points as, something might be going on just fine, and then suddenly there's a tipping point and everything goes to hell in a handbasket, right? And so those are kind of points that you want to keep in mind as we think about this notion of peace and conflict in civil war conditions.